Historian John Garrity has written that the Great Depression was, quote, a worldwide phenomenon composed of an infinite number of separate but related events. Some of the events that led to the Great Depression included war debts and reparations from World War I, agricultural overproduction, inequitable income distribution, the stock market crash, and protectionism. One event leading to the Great Depression was reparations and war debts from World War I. Germany experienced severe economic struggles during the 1920s, largely as a result of the reparations clauses in the Treaty of Versailles. The United States, under the Dawes Plan, had made a loan to Germany to repay the reparations debts owed to the British and the French. Germany had failed to make payments in 1923, and the French retaliated against Germany by occupying the Ruhr region. Once the Great Depression hit, the United States stopped making loans to Germany, and Germany again defaulted on reparations payments. Without the reparations payments, the European nations were unable to repay the $12 billion in war debts they owed collectively to the United States. The situation was rather absurd, but the U.S. did not cancel the loan repayment by the British and French, and they soon defaulted on their loans. When these countries defaulted on loans, the U.S. Federal Reserve managers reacted by raising interest rates. Another event leading to the Great Depression was agricultural overproduction. The price of nearly every export crop in the world fell in the period between 1925 and 1929. Rice depreciated as much as 50%. Coffee fell from 24 cents to 10 cents a pound. The problem was that agricultural production in the decade of the 1920s surpassed demand. Causes of agricultural overproduction included decreasing populations, the increased efficiency of farm machinery, and the choice farmers made to ignore the problem and to continue to overproduce. The farming of crops like beets, cocoa, sugarcane, tea, and wheat all increased. The downturn in exports devastated agriculture worldwide. Farmers everywhere were in debt for both land and machinery before the Great Depression started. Many governments placed tariffs on food and foodstuff imports to try to protect their farmers. But the structural weaknesses of most governments meant economic life was in trouble even in the late 1920s. An event leading to the Great Depression was the inequitable income distribution in the United States. Although the Roaring Twenties are commonly considered a time of prosperity and entertainment in the U.S., by the end of the decade, 12% of the national income was shared by 40% of the population. In contrast, 5% of the population controlled 30% of the nation's income. Even though the U.S. economy had experienced something of a boom, wages had not increased at the same rate as the production of consumer goods. At this time, buying on credit and installment plans became common and seemed to help people. But this extended credit actually decreased the incomes of many people even further. The rich did not consume enough of the goods to offset the overproduction of goods. Supply far exceeded demand. In the summer of 1929, many businesses made cutbacks, which led to higher unemployment and less spending. In turn, this led to even more layoffs. Another important event leading to the Great Depression was the stock market crash. During the 1920s, a long boom took stock prices to unprecedented peaks. Some stocks quadrupled in value. Investors borrowed more and more to invest more and more, convinced that stocks were a, quote, sure thing. Playing the market like this proved disastrous on the most devastating day in the history of the New York stock market. Economic historians usually credit the cause of the Great Depression to the sudden collapse of the United States stock market prices on October 29, 1929, also known as Black Tuesday. This is the day the economic depression became worldwide news. Prices dropped incredibly once people realized the boom of the stock market was over. People stopped buying stocks, which meant some millionaires became bankrupt overnight. The stock market lost $5 billion in value in 3 days. The banking system in the U.S., as well as banks in Central Europe, fell into chaos when banks tried to collect on the loans made to stock market investors who now possess holdings that were worth very little or nothing at all. Many banks had also been investors in the stock market. As the news spread that even the bank's assets were comprised of huge loans and stock certificates that were nearly worthless, citizens withdrew their savings from the banks. Banks began failing by the hundreds, not having the funds to repay loans and meet the demands of depositors. In 1929 and 1930, nearly 750 U.S. banks failed. By the end of the 1930s, approximately 9,000 banks failed. As the United States stopped honoring loans to other countries, the impact of the crash was felt by all countries in the fragile, interdependent world economy. Personal income, tax revenues, prices and profits around the world all plummeted. In many countries, construction was stopped almost completely. World Economic Conference delegates in Geneva in 1927 had recognized that free trade is what contributed to a thriving world economy. This meant that countries could not reap the benefits of international trade unless all countries decreased tariffs on imported goods to allow for market competition with domestic products. Nevertheless, looking to increase domestic consumption, the United States government passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930. This heavily taxed goods imported from other countries, a move to help U.S. industries recover. More than 30 countries filed formal protests in response, but 60 countries retaliated by abandoning free trade and levied their own tariffs on imported goods. The web of tariffs caused international trade to contract by approximately 66% between 1929 and 1934, and the extreme tariffs contributed to the spread of the global crisis of the Great Depression. Unemployment rose in most countries, and European countries found themselves unable to pay off World War I debts and reparations. Less developed countries, like Malaysia, which were often dependent on exporting cash crops and raw materials, suffered as much as 80% drops in export revenues. The protectionist move to support domestic industries through trade policies had a disastrous effect for most countries. This both lengthened and deepened the impacts of the Great Depression. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, most countries abandoned the gold standard, resulting in currencies that no longer had intrinsic value. The currency war of the 1930s is generally considered to have begun in 1931, when Great Britain substantially devalued its currency after taking the pound off the gold standard. With widespread high unemployment, devaluations of national currencies became common. In essence, countries were competing to export unemployment. The Great Depression, which was at its worst in 1933, affected nearly every country in the world and caused some to question the capitalist system. The fluctuations in exchange rates were generally harmful for international traders, and global trade declined sharply as a result. International trade was cut in half during the Great Depression, but because the effects of a devaluation were counteracted by a corresponding devaluation by trading partners, some countries actually gained an advantage. The different roles that governments played in economic affairs meant that some countries and their citizens faced very different realities during the Great Depression.